In 1996, the world was introduced to Lara Croft, the Tomb Raider. Developed by Core Design, Tomb Raider would become both a landmark title and a pop culture phenomenon. For 6 years, the world loved Lara until it all came crashing down in 2003 and the franchise changed hands from Core to Crystal Dynamics, who still owns it to this day. Today, you're going to learn about the people who made the classic Tomb Raider games, and how they did it. We're also going to explore the intricacies of their gameplay, and how they changed sequel to sequel. Finally, you'll see how the franchise collapsed on itself, and took Core down with it. This is how Tomb Raider destroyed Tomb Raider. This story begins in 1988, with the founding of Core Design. In the 80s, the United Kingdom was home to many great game developers. One of these was a company by the name of Gremlin Graphics, creators of the Monty Mole series. Gremlin grew during the 80s off the back of the Monty Mole games and others like Gauntlet and Jack the Nipper, which allowed the company to expand. Unfortunately, this success wouldn't last forever, and Gremlin spread itself much thinner than its financial situation could support, with offices in Lincoln, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Derby. When Gremlin hit hard times in '88, they were forced to close their Derby studio. The Derby employees had the option to commute to Gremlin's main offices in Sheffield every day, but because that was an hour-long drive, they chose to become redundant, or simply forfeit their jobs. A sales executive for Gremlin, Jeremy Heath-Smith, decided that the talent at the Derby office shouldn't be split up. He, along with his brother Adrian Smith, Gremlin's co-founder Kevin Norburn, and a Gremlin programmer, Greg Holmes, worked a deal to retain all of Gremlin Derby's employees and even the offices they worked out of, but they would now be fully independent. Jeremy financed this with a £16,000 loan from his wife. As they could no longer use the Gremlin name, Core Design was formed by Andy Green, Chris Shrigley, Terry Lloyd, Kevin Norburn, Jeremy Heath-Smith, Adrian Smith, Greg Holmes, Simon Phipps, David Pridmore, and Rob Toon. Core would pick up right where Gremlin Derby left off. Their first game was Rick Dangerous, a punishing platformer starring an adventurer trying to escape the Amazon jungle. This obviously wouldn't be the last time Core would flirt with the idea of an Indiana Jones-style character, but in the space between Rick Dangerous and Tomb Raider, Core would make several unique games in different genres like Corporation, Curse of Enchantia, and Soulstar. In this period, Core Design would change quite a bit internally. Chris Shrigley only worked at Core for a year before leaving to form his own studio, Eurocom. Rob Toon, Andy Green, and Terry Lloyd also had short stints before leaving for other prominent British studios. In 1990, Jeremy Heath-Smith bought out Greg Holmes. In 1992, he also bought out Kevin Norburn, and Simon Phipps was gone in 1994. At which point Jeremy and his brother Adrian were the only founding members still at Core Design. When he helped co-found Core, Jeremy Heath-Smith had already been in the games industry for 8 years. He worked in sales, most notably for Activision, before joining Gremlin. Jeremy was Core's chief executive and involved in getting all of Core's projects off the ground. He was also responsible for hiring new talent. The new blood at Core in the 90s quickly learned that Heath-Smith was no nonsense when it came to money, but he also gave everyone an amount of creative freedom that is simply unheard of today. For example, in 1994, Heath-Smith hired Andy Sandom, who successfully pitched his own game during his interview. This would become Core's Blam Machine Head, which Sandom was allowed to head up despite just joining the company. Arguably, Core's most important hiring would come in June of the same year when Heath-Smith hired artist and animator Toby Gard, who would later create Lara Croft. Heath-Smith placed a great amount of trust in Core's creatives and was known for being hands-off. He would come to the different teams at Core and present them games they could work on. He'd also hold meetings with all of Core's employees so they could brainstorm new ideas for games. The culture at Core during this time saw developers choosing the game they wanted to work on, joining the team, working on the game from anywhere to 6 to 11 months, then taking a break before moving on to the next one. 1994 proved to be a very transformative year for Core, who employed around 45 people at the time. Besides hiring the talent that would shape the future of the company, Core itself was bought out by another company called Center Gold. By 94, Core wasn't just developing games, they were also publishing them, and were successful at that too, drawing the attention of larger distribution groups looking to buy the company. Despite the buyout, Core was still allowed autonomy in the games they produced. This resulted in a company-wide meeting in September where Heath-Smith wanted to plot out the future of Core design, and allowed everyone to discuss their ideas for the games that Core could create. Heath-Smith was particularly interested in ideas because he'd been to the Consumer Electronics Show that year, and the 32-bit games on display worried him. He felt that Core had fallen behind and was stuck in the 16-bit era. Earlier in the year, he and his brother Adrian were also invited to Japan to see the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. The concept of 3D graphics and what could be achieved with them blew their minds. Jeremy Heath-Smith was so struck by what he'd seen that he declared that every game in the future would have an FMV intro. Heath-Smith knew there was money to be made, and the goal of September's meeting was to find ideas that could harness the power of the new consoles. Of the 3 or 4 concepts for games thrown around at the Core forum, the one that would change everything came from Toby Gard, who at the time was working on Core's BC Racers. Gard's idea was an adventure game where you'd raid pyramids. It would have action, puzzle solving, and exploration. You would also see and control the character from a third-person perspective, and the game would have a film-like presentation. At that point, Gard only had sketches. Even though Heath-Smith showed interest in the concept, Gard would need something more concrete to officially pitch Tomb Raider. The idea of a 3D game with this sort of scope at the time was daunting, so much so that Gard's first pitch for Tomb Raider was rejected because he couldn't find a single programmer willing to work on the project. All of the other programmers at Core were too intimidated because they'd never worked on a 3D game before. Gard was undeterred, and while he worked on BC Racers, he continued fleshing out Tomb Raider in his spare time. But without a 3D programmer, the project simply could not move forward. Gard's prayers would be answered just a few weeks later when Core hired Paul Douglas, a programmer who'd sent out a 3D demo of his to various studios. Once Gard heard of this, he approached Douglas with his ideas for Tomb Raider. Douglas agreed to help because he found the concept of Tomb Raider to be so different from the 3D games that existed at the time. When they'd clock out from work at Core, Gard and Douglas would get together and brainstorm how to create the 3D technology necessary to realize Tomb Raider. Douglas would have to write a 3D engine from scratch, and it would need to accommodate a character who could move freely in 3-dimensional space. The engine would also require compatibility with Autodesk 3D Studio, an emerging program that the team would later use to create FMVs and animations. When Gard finally finished on BC Racers, he and Douglas would formally pitch Tomb Raider to Jeremy Heath-Smith in December. Heath-Smith was apprehensive. He was presented a design document, but no visuals illustrating how the game's ambitious 3D component would actually work. Still, Heath-Smith gave them the okay, and told Gard and Douglas that they could work on this project for a few months. The caveat was that if they were unable to demonstrate the concepts in the Tomb Raider design doc in this amount of time, they would scrap the game and use the 3D technology to make a first-person shooter or a fighting game instead. Overseeing the game's progress would be Troy Horton and Adrian Smith as producers. Gard and Douglas quickly started working on a proof of concept in early 1995, and this is the year the Tomb Raider team, the technology behind the game, and Lara Croft would all be created. At the start of 95, the team consisted of just Toby Gard and Paul Douglas working in a small office. Douglas was writing the engine, and Gard was working in 3D Studio on creating models and animations that would be exported into the engine for the game's proof of concept. Their proof of concept quickly materialized, and was known simply as the T-Rex demo. There were no effects, no texturing, just meshes, a person, the room they were in, and a large T-Rex. The human character could move around the environment, and despite no enemy AI, the game's potential was obvious. They showed their proof of concept to Jeremy Heath-Smith, who thought it was amazing. He'd never seen anything like it. But Heath-Smith was also shocked by something else. The playable character was a woman, and this was the first time he had ever laid eyes on who would eventually become Lara Croft. Earlier, the idea for a male lead character had been scrapped, and all trace of Fletcher Christian, Tomb Raider's male protagonist, was gone. Initially, Toby Gard pitched a male because he felt it was the most likely option to get the game approved, but really he wanted a female lead, and had already shown sketches of her to others at Core. Once Jeremy Heath-Smith rejected the idea of Gard's male lead because he thought his resemblance to Indiana Jones would get the studio sued, Gard saw the T-Rex demo as his opportunity to sell the game with his original female protagonist. When he was designing her in '94, she didn't have a name, and those who saw her original designs didn't think this character belonged in the type of game Gard was describing. He was nudged in the right direction by Simon Phipps, who suggested Tank Girl as an inspiration, so Gard changed her design further as a result. The name Laura Cruz was created by Guy Miller, Core's creative manager, and first appeared in Tomb Raider's version 1.0 design document. When Heath-Smith saw the woman in the T-Rex demo, he was mixed on the idea of a game led by a woman, because it hadn't been done before. But once he saw Gard's sketches of Cruz, he came around on the idea and approved the game for full production. After the T-Rex demo, Gard and Douglas got a knock on their door from a co-worker looking to start work on a new project at Core. This was Heather Stevens. Stevens had just finished on Core's Skeleton Crew and was trying to decide what to work on next. Stevens had previously worked at Rare as a graphics artist, and once she had spoke with Gard and Douglas about their game, she became Tomb Raider's first level designer. Initially, Stevens had trouble understanding exactly what the game's levels were meant to look like when she discussed them with Toby Gard. There was still no tangible 3D visual to go off of, so to better communicate his vision for the game, Gard made a 3D demo of an Egyptian tomb. Heather then understood what Toby wanted from Tomb Raider's levels, and started working on how to approach them. But she would quickly run into one of Tomb Raider's major challenges. 3D Studio, the program that the team was using to create models and animations, could not build levels. 3D Studio could make singular models, but complex non-static 3D environments were impossible, because graphics accelerators, or what we know now as GPUs, weren't common in computers yet. The computers at Core, the ones being used to build Tomb Raider specifically, would take hours to render an environment and couldn't be used for quick visualization. Besides this, 3D editors at the time had no polygon shading like they do today. Back then, everything in real time in 3D was done by the computer's CPU, meaning that objects could only be displayed in wireframe view. This combination made working on levels incredibly confusing, and therefore unfeasible. Tomb Raider would need another programming genius, and it soon found one in the form of Gavin Rummery. Rummery joined Core in '95, just after finishing his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He studied AI and was even a member of the university's Machine Intelligence Laboratory. On his very first day at Core, he spoke with Toby Gard, who told him about Tomb Raider. Gard showed him everything the team had made so far, and Rummery was sold. Gavin joined the team and immediately noticed the problem that Heather Stevens was having with level construction in 3D Studio. Rummery believed Tomb Raider would be impossible to make without a tool that could both build and quickly iterate levels. He was stuck for some time on how to design it, until he drew inspiration from Ultima Underworld, a game that was built on a 3-dimensional grid. Every space that the player could move into was a square, and environments were comprised of squares atop each other that would form walls, platforms, and other structures. Rummery thought making Tomb Raider grid-based would be its path to viability, and discussed it with Toby Gard, who agreed. He began working on a level engine that could build environments in real time with proper visualization and customization. Gavin Rummery's tile approach for levels would be the basis for the language of Tomb Raider, something we'll talk about later. Rummery's level engine and Douglas's 3D engine were now being built in parallel, and both had compatibility with 3D Studio and Photoshop so that Toby Gard could import animations and Heather Stevens could import textures. Stevens wouldn't be Tomb Raider's only level designer for much longer, as the team would gain its fifth member, Neil Boyd, while Rummery was working on prototypes for the level engine. Boyd had been hired at Core around the same time as Rummery, but his area of expertise was in computer-assisted design and architecture, which made him a shoo-in for working on levels. Unlike Stevens, who was big on texturing and knew how to digitize textures to put them in the game, Boyd was more into structural design. The two complemented each other well, and when Rummery had working versions of the level editor, Stevens and Boyd quickly went in and began experimenting. Working in unison with all of the technology made for the game, the 5 team members created the foundation of Tomb Raider. With a protagonist, a team, and a vision, Tomb Raider's biggest challenges awaited in 1996, when the bulk of the work on the game would be done and it'd see a release at the end of the year. But 1996 was as definitive for Core itself as it was for Tomb Raider. In April of 96, Core was changed forever when their parent company, Center Gold, was bought out by Eidos Interactive Limited. Upon its acquisition of Core, Jeremy Heath-Smith became a board member at Eidos and their head of product development. He'd also remain managing director at Core, overseeing the day-to-day operations of the company and the state of the games. The development of Tomb Raider was well on its way by this time. The team had gained its 6th and final full-time team member in the form of Jason Gosling, who did additional programming and would later single-handedly port the game to the Sega Saturn. By May of 96, Gard and others had written version 1.8 of Tomb Raider's design document, this time going in-depth regarding levels, enemies, traps, menus, and how the camera would function. This version also contained the game's entire script, which was rewritten largely by Core employee Vicky Arnold. Though Vicky wasn't considered part of the game's full-time team, she worked alongside them to create Lara's character, motivations, and backstory. But even by this late date, there was no Lara Croft. This document still refers to Lara with the surname Cruz, which was changed to Croft once Core's marketing and the Tomb Raider team decided that Lara should sound as British as possible. The name Croft was found in a phone book by Vicky Arnold, and Gard believed it just sounded right. Though Gard created Lara, she was a collaborative creation, even down to how she sounds. When the team needed placeholder audio for the things Lara would say, they just recorded some of the team members. Lara's infamous "no" is actually the voice of Heather Stevens. She and Susie Hamilton, a member of Core's marketing team, provided a few of Lara's excerpts from gameplay. Some of Lara's gasps are even the voice of Tomb Raider's audio director, Nathan McCree. These lines made it into the final game, even though Lara was voiced in cutscenes by actress Shelley Blonde. Despite having made most of the technology for Tomb Raider in 1995, the team still had to build the entire game in a little over a year. Jeremy Heath-Smith described the development of Tomb Raider as only being possible because the team worked 15-hour days for 7 days a week. It was incredibly challenging, and the team faced many problems. For example, even though Rummery's level editor was a godsend, it would frequently crash, and both Stevens and Boyd would lose progress on levels this way. There were also, of course, many revisions to gameplay. Lara used to be able to lock on to 2 different targets at once. This feature was scrapped. As development progressed, Eidos began coming up with ways to market Tomb Raider. Core was actually acquired because Eidos' chairman at the time, Ian Livingstone, saw Tomb Raider when he was invited to the Core offices, and he immediately knew they had to buy the company. Everyone at Eidos was enthusiastic and saw Lara as the centerpiece of an expansive marketing campaign. The team's efforts on the game and Eidos' marketing were displayed during April and May at the European Computer Trade Show and E3 with the first demos for Tomb Raider. The game got very positive reception from those that attended, with high praise for its 3D visuals and smooth gameplay. Eidos also hired models to dress as Lara, including Natalie Cook, who would be the first model to portray Lara in magazines. For the Tomb Raider team, this reception and popularity came as a shock, They were very secluded during its development, so seeing this level of marketing for the game and such a strong positive reception was both flattering and vindicating. Still, there was much work to be done on the game, and when the team returned from the conventions, Toby Gard began to express worries that he didn't know if Tomb Raider could be finished by the game's October deadline, because there was still so much work to do. Core employees Jocelyn Joss Charmé and Stuart Atkinson were pulled in to help with animations during the last 3 months of development. And then, things got worse. One day, Jeremy Heath-Smith walked into the team's office and asked them if they could get the Saturn version of the game out before the PC and PS1 versions. The team resoundingly said
no.
Heath-Smith asked again, saying that the deal with Sega would be lucrative. The team again said
no.
This is when Heath-Smith revealed that he already signed the deal, and the team would need to get the Sega Saturn version of Tomb Raider released 6 weeks before the other platforms. This caused mayhem for the team's already insane schedule, as they'd essentially lost an entire month's worth of development time. The Sega Saturn was notably more difficult to program for than the PC or the PS1, and its port was handled by Jason Gosling, who worked himself to the bone to get it done. Matters weren't much better for Nathan McCree, who composed the game's soundtrack in just 4 weeks, or Martin Iveson, who did its sound effects in the same time frame. The pressure to get Tomb Raider out was so much that Toby Gard became ill, and he missed the last few weeks of development. During that time, everyone else practically lived at the core offices, working countless hours in order to get the game ready in time. And they did. On October 25th, 1996, Tomb Raider was released. Early during development, Jeremy Heath-Smith projected Tomb Raider sales figures at just 25,000 copies. Eidos then later projected sales of 100,000. As reviews came in from all around the world, and retailers were calling non-stop to buy more copies because they had sold out, everyone at Core and Eidos knew the game had crushed all expectations. And now it's time to talk about the game itself. What is the language of Tomb Raider? Tomb Raider and its first 4 sequels all use Gavin Rummery's grid-based framework. Lara exists in a world of squares, and her animations and movement accommodate this. When Lara does a stationary jump, she covers 2 squares. If you move back a square, run, and then jump, she covers 3. These rules never change, and create a consistency that helps its controls and movement become second nature. The game rewards you for understanding how to maneuver Lara, and navigating its tight platforming is satisfying because it requires skill. With revolutionary gameplay across 15 levels and a stunning protagonist, Tomb Raider reigned over sales charts during 96's holiday season, and that meant big checks for the Tomb Raider team. You see, Jeremy Heath-Smith was unlike most studio heads. He didn't want to create animosity and bitterness between Core's developers, producers, and executives with large wage gaps. So Core's contracts stipulated that developers would receive royalties based on game sales. Core's previous games sold enough to keep the lights on, but they didn't exactly set the world on fire. Tomb Raider, however, sold enough copies to set all 6 full-time team members up for life. The first check alone was for £30,000. The Tomb Raider team had not only created a wonderful game, they were now about to make more money than they'd ever seen. One would think this would be a cause for celebration, and it was, for everyone but Toby Gard and Paul Douglas. Lara Croft was Toby's creative child. He created her, but in his view, had also seen her exploited by Eidos and their marketing efforts. Toby wasn't a fan of Lara's portrayal in media, and didn't create her look with the intent that it be the focus of her character. According to Toby, Lara's proportions came from the inability to do realism at the time. Since it wasn't possible anyways, Lara's proportions were accentuated so they could portray the female form better, given that they only had 200 polygons to make her. Gavin Rummery says that Toby's vision of Lara was an ice queen, a cold character who wouldn't pose or dress the way that marketing depicted her. Lara's look and attitude were meant to establish her as unattainable, not necessarily sexy. It didn't help that when Toby Gard offered his input on marketing, he was ignored by Eidos. Eidos' marketing team was described by core employees as invisible. They'd never see them. They would just get requests from them for 3D renders of Lara, and Core would make them. While everyone else on the team saw a bigger picture for both Lara and Tomb Raider, Gard was very upset that Eidos was now making all of the decisions. The biggest of which, a sequel. Toby Gard thought Tomb Raider would be a one-off. He wanted to go work on something else after, and presumably for Tomb Raider to remain untouched. Between this and his feelings about how Lara was marketed, he and Paul Douglas, who agreed with him, threatened to leave Core. Everyone on the team begged them to stay. They were friends, and they had just pulled off the impossible. But the two wouldn't budge. Jeremy Heath-Smith, who had a strong friendship with Gard, was also unable to convince him to stay. Heath-Smith even said that the two could stay and just not work on Tomb Raider 2 at all. The reason Heath-Smith was so adamant about Gard and Douglas staying is because Core's contracts only paid royalties as long as you worked at Core. With Tomb Raider sales skyrocketing and showing no signs of stopping, the incoming royalties were about to be massive. But even this wasn't enough. Toby Gard and Paul Douglas left Core at the start of the new year, and according to Heath-Smith, lost out on over £1 million in royalties. The rest of the Tomb Raider team, now fresh off of a month-long holiday vacation, had to pick up the pieces of a fractured team so they could make a sequel by next Christmas. This is 1997, and the development of Tomb Raider 2. In Douglas's absence, Gavin Rummery was made lead programmer of Tomb Raider 2. With Toby Gard gone, Stuart Atkinson became lead animator. Jason Gosling and Josh Charmet stayed on as programmer and character animator, respectively, and the game's level designers would once again be Heather Stevens and Neil Boyd. Vicky Arnold would return to write the script too. Joining the team would be Andy Sandom as an FMV artist. Stevens and Boyd would also be helped by a new level designer, Richard Morton, and managing the game's production would again be Adrian Smith and Troy Horton. Eidos wanted the sequel out by Christmas, meaning that the team had around 10 months to iterate and expand on what they'd just done. But it was because they were adding that the task was feasible. The technology to create a Tomb Raider game had already been developed, and the team knew full well what its limitations were and what they wanted to improve for 2. They'd no longer have to worry about a Sega Saturn port, because Eidos signed a deal with Sony to make Tomb Raider exclusive on consoles to PlayStation. Tomb Raider's tech received a polish pass, so tools like Rummery's level editor wouldn't crash so frequently anymore. This enabled Stevens and Boyd to immediately jump into making levels. Atkinson and Charmet also quickly got to work on animations, notably adding Lara's vehicle animations and her mid-air turn. They also adjusted her run cycle so that she could jump from any point in the animation and not just when both her feet were on the floor. The two animated more on this project in a few months than they had done for all of the first game. Even Nathan McCree was given double the time to work on the soundtrack, and he produced double the music. Gavin Rummery summarized the development of Tomb Raider 2 as hard but straightforward. They worked themselves harder than they had on the first game, but they understood what they needed to do and how to do it. While the team worked on the sequel, Lara herself became an emerging celebrity. At first it was only gaming magazines that wanted her on their covers, but eventually Core was getting requests to do popular British newspapers and magazines like The Face. Lara had broken into the mainstream and fit perfectly into British culture. Jeremy Heath-Smith credits Lara's initial popularity to the fact that she looked like a real person. In his own words, he theorized that Mario, or another animal mascot, perhaps didn't have the appeal that mass publications were looking for to put on a cover. But Lara Croft could be on anything. Back in these days, you could write to the core offices, and during small breaks, the team would read letters written by fans. Some fans were smitten by Lara, and others saw her as a role model. There were even some that were critical of the gameplay in Tomb Raider 1 and gave the team insight on what they needed to change and fix. Neil Boyd, for example, was infamous for designing traps that would instantly kill Lara, and had to be talked out of some of the most cheeky ones so that players wouldn't feel frustrated. As Stevens and Boyd worked on level design in 2, they knew they wanted exterior locations and to explore the concept of modern tombs like the wreck of the Maria Doria. The engine for 2 could finally do skyboxes, which also opened the door for levels like Venice. Many of Tomb Raider 2's animations were informed by its locales, and Stuart Atkinson remodeled Lara and did all of her water-related animations, including Lara's boat. The schedule for Tomb Raider 2 was very tight and didn't allow for much diversion. Late into development, Josh Charmet added Winston, Lara's butler who follows her around and who could be trapped in the manor's freezer. Croft Manor would end up being very important because the team didn't want the game to end with Lara going down a slope again like in Tomb Raider 1. So they reused Lara's home as a level and packed it with enemies. In the game's ending, Lara shoots the camera right before the player can see her undress, which is a nod to the rumors of a nude raider cheat code that were so widespread they had to be addressed and denied by Jeremy Heath-Smith. Tomb Raider 2 was a labor of love and saw the team crunch for the last 6 months of its development. It released on November 21st to global acclaim, and even stronger launch sales than the first game. Although everyone on the team was satisfied with their work, the long nights at core had begun to take effect on some of their personal relationships. Neil Boyd got divorced because his wife thought that he was having an affair when he was really just working on the game. Gavin Rummery would also miss calls from his mother intentionally because he didn't have time to speak with her. The money they stood to make from their royalty checks was an amazing incentive, but it couldn't solve all their problems. Rummery and Boyd, alongside Stevens and others on the team, knew that they could not do another crunch cycle for Tomb Raider, no matter how much they were paid. They went home after the release of Tomb Raider 2 and took all of December off. But elsewhere at core, someone was experimenting. Martin Gibbons, a programmer who worked with Andy Sandom on Blam Machine Head, spent the last months of 1997 working on a game using the Tomb Raider engine that featured a male lead and lots of action and shooting. Gibbons programmed new technology into the engine for better character movement and fluidity. This game would never see the light of day, but it would be crucial for the future of Tomb Raider. In January of 1998, the team returned from vacation with ideas for Tomb Raider 3. Initially, they wanted 2 years to make the game. Eidos said no. They wanted another game out by Christmas. Upon hearing this, Rummery, Boyd, and Stevens walked into Jeremy Heath-Smith's office and handed him their notices. Heath-Smith rejected them and asked them to hold on while he spoke to others at Eidos. He came back to the team with a unique offer. The Tomb Raider 2 team would teach other core devs how to work with the game's tools so they could make a side game that would take place after Tomb Raider 2 but before Tomb Raider 3. After training them, they'd be able to go work on their own version of 3. This sounded great, and the team agreed. But there was just one problem. The team working on this side project ended up doing a lot of custom work on the engine regarding lighting and the complexity of object geometry. Eventually, this side project became Tomb Raider 3. This decision was made without the knowledge of Rummery or anyone else from the Tomb Raider 2 team. In fact, they found out about this through an Eidos press release. They were frustrated, to say the least, and let their feelings be known to Jeremy, but they were so exhausted by then that they didn't put up a fight. It didn't help that their own ideas for Tomb Raider 3 weren't coming together, so they abandoned this version to work on something new altogether. Rummery, Stevens, Boyd, Atkinson, and Charmet all left Tomb Raider in early 1998 to start work on a new core game called Project Eden. This meant that Tomb Raider 3 would have fresh blood. The game's lead programmer was Martin Gibbons, whose custom work on the Tomb Raider engine for his game that was cancelled would be inherited by Tomb Raider 3. He'd be joined on programming by Chris Coop, and the game would have a new position specifically for programming AI, held by Tom Scott. Like Gavin Rummery, Tom was a doctor in artificial intelligence, having done his PhD in neural networks and robotics at the University of Southampton. No expense was spared gathering talent for this third game. It had to meet the quality bar set by the last two, which is why Andy Sandom remained on the team, this time also doing level design in addition to environment art. Richard Morton would also return as a level designer, and his brother Jamie Morton would join the team in the same role. Vicky Arnold would return one last time to pen the game's script, and so would Nathan McCree, despite having left Core by this point to become a freelancer. Sandom describes Tomb Raider 3's development team as great friends, and something he took for granted because he didn't realize that the kinship they shared between them wasn't normal for the games industry. Everyone got along great, as opposed to some of his later projects where everyone was at each other's throats. Topping off this newly formed team would be a returning Adrian Smith and Troy Horton as producers. Tomb Raider 3, from its inception, was a game where the desire was to make something completely different than the first two games in order to offset potential franchise fatigue. This was executed most notably in the game's level design and overall structure. The level design and Lara's progression in the first two games was seen by the team on 3 as linear. Levels would only ever take you in one direction, and you couldn't choose what levels to play at what time. To address these concerns, Tomb Raider 3's level design was made more maze-like, and its objectives spread throughout its levels to promote exploration instead of everything being down one path. The game would also start Lara in India, but once complete, it opened up and you could choose between 3 different locations. Another very large change for 3 was that it was the first developed with PlayStation in mind. Tomb Raider 1 and 2 were built for PCs and didn't take full advantage of some of the PlayStation's hardware. Core even received help from Sony to make this possible. The first two games worked with an 8-bit color palette, but 3 would use a 16-bit color palette, allowing for transparency and colored lighting. This let Martin Gibbons go crazy with the effects he could add, like smoke and particles. With the new levels of geometry they could achieve, they could build more rounded surfaces and more detailed geometry in general, which gave 3 a significant step up visually. It helped that a lot of this engine work was done during late 1997 and early 1998 before the game had to go into full production. Once it did, the team would, again, only have 10 months to complete the game. Lara was not remodeled for 3, but she was given several new animations for new mechanics like crawl spaces and monkey bars. Tom Scott created a litany of new enemies, all with new AI, that wouldn't let Lara simply blast away from them from an elevated surface. The team also tweaked the camera in 3 so that it wouldn't get stuck in corners or zoom into Lara so much anymore. In June of '98, while Core worked on the game, Eidos announced Tomb Raider, the movie. Lara had become insanely popular. Her game sold over 6 million copies, she was on magazines, and she even had toys. A Tomb Raider film just made sense. It would be made by Paramount and was scheduled for a release in late 1999. The last months of development on Tomb Raider 3 were as tight and filled with crunch as the last game. Andy Sandom said that they'd get into work at 10 and work until 3 in the morning and just kept doing this until the game was finished. They put up with it because they'd get their huge royalty checks at the end of development, and once Tomb Raider 3 released on November 20th, 1998, that's exactly what happened. But this time, when everyone did their yearly December vacation, they weren't necessarily excited to come back to work on another Tomb Raider game. Jeremy Heath-Smith credited Tomb Raider 3's existence to consumer demand for more Tomb Raider games. No one at Core expected to do the game so quickly. It was a demand from Eidos. Jeremy was, of course, aware of the crunch the team was going through because he was there too, and also worked long nights at the studio. Even Heath-Smith thought that they would take 1999 off, but because Tomb Raider 3 had been successful and the team was able to get it out in such a short amount of time, Eidos believed that Core could make Tomb Raider games yearly forever. So when everyone came back to work the next year, they would have to make another sequel by Christmas. This would become Tomb Raider 4, The Last Revelation, and 1999 would be the end of Lara Croft. Nathan McCree and Vicki Arnold left Core after Tomb Raider 3. McCree was replaced by Peter Connolly, who would do the soundtrack for the next 3 games. With Vicki Arnold gone, an opportunity presented itself to Andy Sandom. Sandom and the rest of the team were fed up. He and Richard Morton had done 2 straight years on Tomb Raider, and the rest of the team had just come off the crunch of the 3rd game. For Tomb Raider 4, Sandom would take over scriptwriting duties. Now in charge of the story, he proposed something radical for the game during a meeting in January. They were going to kill Lara Croft. The plot of Tomb Raider 4 sees Lara accidentally unleashing an evil god named Set, who will destroy the world unless Lara can summon Horus, the god who originally imprisoned Set. It also pits Lara against her former mentor, Werner von Croy. The team agreed with Sandom and decided from the game's very first draft that it would end with Lara falling to her death. This was the team's way of rebelling against the franchise for having to work on it for so long. The pay was great, but the schedule was horrible, and by now, everyone on the team had felt it. Richard Morton said that while he was working on Tomb Raider 4, he had developed a love-hate relationship with Lara. Some days he would hate just looking at her, and others, the days when new features would be implemented, he would love working on the game again. Despite their reluctance to work on another game, the team was not going to just phone it in. Due to criticisms of 3 from both Eidos and players that the locations in 3 strayed too far from what the series was known for, Jeremy Heath-Smith told the team to put Lara back in tombs. So The Last Revelation was set in Egypt and had a completely different structure than the games before. It had a hub system and huge levels you had to explore different parts of to progress down certain paths. The platforming was also made easier, as Tomb Raider 3's was said to have been too difficult, and 4 had more focus on puzzles than combat. Lara was entirely remodeled for the game, and actually given moving joints in her mesh, which were referred to as smooth single skin technology. Because the game does flashbacks to Lara's past, a younger version of her was designed. The pigtails in her teen design were likely chosen because Adrian Smith notoriously disliked pigtails, and joked that if the team ever gave Lara that hairstyle, he'd shut down production. While Sandom and the team worked on Tomb Raider 4, rumors circulated that Sony would soon share news about a new console. The PlayStation 2 was announced in March of 1999, and because of Core's close relationship with Sony, they were given very early looks at its hardware. Adrian Smith realized that Tomb Raider would have to move on from the PlayStation 1. Adrian assembled a very small group of 3 core employees to work on ideas for Tomb Raider Next Generation, despite Sandom's team working on a game where Lara would die. The team's intention to kill Lara was not known by all of Core's higher-ups. The way Core's hierarchy worked was that Troy Horton would receive development updates and milestones from the team. These would be seen and shared with Adrian Smith, who oversaw the development of all of Core's games, and then everything would be taken to Jeremy Heath-Smith. Because Heath-Smith was so hands-off on the development of individual games, and he was so busy with his role at Eidos, Sandom and the team were able to keep Lara's death a secret until pretty late into development when the FMVs were made. Andy Sandom's relationship with Jeremy Heath-Smith was great. He's called him the best boss he ever had, and appreciated that Jeremy just let people work and didn't interfere with day-to-day development. Unfortunately, that came back to bite Jeremy because he had no awareness of what the team was planning. When Heath-Smith saw the game's final FMV and realized that the team had just killed Lara, Sandom said that you could hear him swearing several offices away. Originally, the team planned to simply decapitate Lara, but they feared that Jeremy would decapitate them. Heath-Smith yelled at all of them after seeing the cutscene and told them they'd have to fix it somehow. But they didn't, and when Tomb Raider 4 shipped in November, there were no consequences for killing Lara. Eidos just wanted games called Tomb Raider. They didn't care how Lara was in the game, so her livelihood was inconsequential. Sandem's plan had failed, but he always knew it would. The Lara machine was simply too big at that point, and killing her was more cathartic for the team than anything else. After the game released, it was back to vacation, and despite the team being very happy with what they were able to accomplish in The Last Revelation, no one wanted to come back to work on another Tomb Raider game. Everything came to a head in early 2000, when Tomb Raider and Core started down a path of no return. Coming back from vacation, no one on the Tomb Raider 4 team wanted to do another sequel. And no one thought they would. Everyone expected that they'd finally get to work on a new project until Eidos came down with another Christmas sequel mandate, this time for Tomb Raider Chronicles. The team that had just done 4 was mentally done, but they were forced to work on it anyways. The team's frustration was such that they'd openly talk about their displeasure in interviews. Richard Morton has said that he was not too happy about having to work on the game, while Martin Gibbons was extremely pissed off about having to do it. Andy Sandem has outright called Chronicles a load of old shit. While you can point to several missteps the franchise had seen by this point, none were greater than Tomb Raider Chronicles, and who was working on what during this time at Core. The group of Core developers who were working on Chronicles were a very experienced team, not just in their amazing work on Tomb Raider, but in game development overall. The idea was that this team was reliable and had proven that they could ship a competent Tomb Raider game in a single year, so putting them on Chronicles was a safe bet. But if they were working on Chronicles, then who was working on Tomb Raider Next Generation? The answer is the same 3 people who had been working on it since 1999. Pete Duncan, Mark Donald, and James Kenny. The plan was while Sandem's team would work on Chronicles, this team of 3 would work on Next Generation, and the 2 teams would merge after Chronicles was done, and they'd finish development on Next Generation together. The earliest design document for Next Generation from May of 2000 lays out a plan to put Tomb Raider on PlayStation 2 and the generational leaps the game would benefit from. This team had been given a PS2 development kit earlier in '99 and were very excited about its capabilities. This design doc says that the series will see a radical shift from large tombs Lara explores to smaller locations where she can interact with lots of NPCs. The game would also feature a developing skill set that improves with experience and reflects the direction in which the player pushes Lara. At this time, the story for Tomb Raider Next Generation was that Lara had retired after almost dying at the end of The Last Revelation. She'd become a researcher in archaeology at the British Museum and was convinced to come out of retirement when a friend brought her an old artifact. Adrian Smith, who was overseeing the production of Next Generation, was not satisfied with the game's narrative direction and brought in a writer named Murdy Schofield to pen the game's script. Murdy was a very accomplished writer and had worked in film, television, and game development, even previously for Core on 1999's Fighting Force 2. Adrian told Murdy that he wanted the story of Next Generation to be completely different from anything Tomb Raider had done before. The point of the project was to be as revolutionary for a new era as Tomb Raider was in 1996. Murdy got to work, and one of his biggest inspirations for Next Generation's story was a book that depicted fallen angels as a part of an ancient race called the Nephilim. This was From the Ashes of Angels, The Forbidden Legacy of a Fallen Race, by author Andrew Collins. Murdy wrote and wrote and wrote, drafting all sorts of backstories about the characters that Lara would meet and the adventures that awaited her in a dark underworld. Over the next few months, this team would expand, and by the end of the year, Tomb Raider Next Generation had changed from this, an unused demo that the team had created for E3, to this, a cinematic of Lara being chased by the police in a dark city that was sneaked into the extras of Tomb Raider Chronicles. Sandom and the others had crunched for yet another stretch of months on Chronicles, because no one wanted to work on the game. Its flaws and dated technology were apparent to both players and critics. Upon its November release, the game received unfavorable reviews and became the worst-selling Tomb Raider game, not even breaking 1 million copies back then. The famous royalty checks wouldn't be nearly as big this time around, and the game left many core developers wondering if they should even return to the studio after their yearly December vacation. Chronicles would be Troy Horton's final game at Core, but the rest of the team did return, and 2001 would be one of Tomb Raider's biggest yet most difficult years ever. When the Chronicles team came back to work, they merged with the Next Generation team, but they were stunned when they realized the state the game was in. Before Sandom's team merged with it, Next Generation's team was sizable, but they had no structure, meaning that people were creating content with no idea of how it was going to fit into what others were doing. There was simply no coherent game or a plan to finish it. When the Next Gen team was given their PS2 dev kit, they thought what it could achieve was limitless. Next Generation wasn't just ambitious, it was impossible. And that's what Andy Sandom and Richard Morton told Murdy and the rest of the team once they joined it. Sandom specifically said that they would have to cut 90% of the content they envisioned, otherwise they were fucked. This was all too much for Sandom, who couldn't bear to work on another Tomb Raider game, and especially not one which he had discovered was a complete mess. Andy Sandom left Core in early 2002. Richard Morton stayed and played a big part in the new game's development. Next Generation's situation was not helped by the existence of Curtis Trent, a new secondary playable character Lara would meet in the game. When Murdy joined the team in 2000, Adrian Smith asked him to come up with ideas for a character that Core could feature in a spin-off. The plan was to debut Curtis in this new game, and then have him be a part of his own title later on. Murdy had written much more than could be put into one game, and had to cut the vast majority of it when it became clear that it couldn't be executed. Something else the team would struggle with was the format for this new game. Adrian Smith envisioned Tomb Raider Next Generation as an episodic adventure. It would release in episodes that would be their own full games, and you could download new episodes when they became available. The reason for this was so Core could establish their technology for the very first game, and then release episodes yearly using the same technology, similar to what they'd done for the last 5 games. The only problem? There was no technology. The Next Generation team had no real tool set to work with for this new game. The editors that Gavin Rummery made in '95, which powered Tomb Raider I through Chronicles, were too old to be used, and the Next Gen team created a new engine specifically for PlayStation 2 that lacked the tools necessary to efficiently make the game they were trying to develop. From the outside looking in, no one could tell Tomb Raider was in so much trouble, especially not in June, when after numerous delays, the Tomb Raider movie starring Angelina Jolie would finally release. While Jolie's performance as Lara was praised, the film's plot was heavily criticized, and it reviewed poorly. Despite that, Lara Croft Tomb Raider became the highest grossing film starring a woman at the time. Back at Core, things only went from bad to worse when Sony changed the specs of the PS2 hardware for revisions to the console. The Next Generation team had been working on unfinished PlayStation 2 architecture, and now with such a radical change in internal hardware, they were forced to scrap over a year's worth of work, including the engine they'd made. By then, everyone realized that Next Generation was in serious trouble, but Core management was slow to do anything about it. The Next Gen team was just told to continue working on the game's features, but there was still no goal in mind for how to join everything together. Going into 2002, the team saved what they could of Next Gen's first version, and built a new foundation to house it, and began developing critical tools. With some more steady footing, Eidos held a press conference in March to formally announce the game. Tomb Raider Next Generation officially became Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, and was announced for a November 15th release date. With so much work needing to be done, Core called all hands on deck to finish the game, and even made a call to an old friend. Gavin Rummery left Core in mid-2002 after the release of Project Eden. Despite the original Tomb Raider team's best efforts, the game was met with lukewarm reception and disappointed in sales. Afterwards, Rummery left to explore the mobile gaming market, but was persuaded to return to Core later in the year to help ship Angel of Darkness. Rummery rejoined Core in the position of Technical Development Manager, and was tasked with creating one unified engine that the entire studio could use for all of Core's games. When Rummery saw the work on Angel of Darkness, he couldn't believe what he was looking at. A game with unachievable scope, a terrible attempt to salvage a year's worth of work, and a story so long it was meant to be told across 3 different games. According to him, the project had no organization or communication between the teams working on it. With all of this in mind, you may be asking, where was Jeremy Heath-Smith? According to Jeremy, by 2002, he was basically co-running Eidos, and this distracted him from the very big problem brewing at Core with Tomb Raider. In particular, Sony's decision to change the PS2 hardware affected all of Eidos' studios, not just Core, and he had to handle the needs of multiple teams. It's important to remember that Heath-Smith used to hire all of Core's employees individually, but with how Core had grown, those days were over. Core had started to just hire people in batches without teaching them the culture of the studio. For many, Angel of Darkness was just another job, and with the project's complete lack of leadership, a lot of developers would come into work and not even know what they had to work on that day. Tomb Raider The Angel of Darkness was originally scheduled for release in November of 2002, but for the first time in Tomb Raider history, Eidos delayed the game to February of 2003 because Core told them there was no chance they could finish it by then. With this delay and the studio finally organizing themselves to release the game, the cutting began. Immediately scrapped were plans to make the game episodic and 2 entire chapters of it which made up half its levels. As for the rest of the game's cut content, it may not even be possible to name all of it, but here are just some of the most notable examples. An explanation for how Lara survives at the end of The Last Revelation? Cut. The game's upgrade system? Cut. Lara's dual wielding? Cut. Curtis's psychic powers? Cut. Important characters and their motivations? A different control scheme for Lara. More uses of the game's currency system? Several areas from numerous levels? Dual targeting? Cut, 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 cut. Core was cutting content from the game all the way into the next year, and even with everything they removed from the game, Angel of Darkness was delayed a second time to June. The year is 2003, and we finally reached the end of Core's time on Tomb Raider. Before the release of Angel of Darkness, Jeremy Heath-Smith told the rest of Eidos that the game was not finished. He had seen it, played it, and like everyone else at Core, knew it was a mess. But Eidos was chasing a very specific release date. If Angel of Darkness shipped before June 30th, it would count for that financial quarter, and Eidos would make significantly more money in pre-tax profit. So, on June 20th, 2003, after one of the most troubled development cycles ever, Tomb Raider The Angel of Darkness was released. Speaking personally, Angel of Darkness is the worst game I have ever played. It is also the most unfinished game ever released, and playing it is agonizing because of how buggy, obtuse, and directionless it is. You can tell something is deeply wrong with it the second you move Lara because its controls are horrendous. The controls are so bad, in fact, that Jeremy Heath-Smith struggled to even get Lara to climb the first bin in the game's tutorial and swore heavily in front of others while demonstrating the game at an Eidos buyers conference. The camera is equally atrocious, and both it and the controls make the game almost unplayable. What you're seeing right now is what's been referred to by an anonymous Core employee as the worst opening level of any game. And I would agree. Unfortunately, the game doesn't get any better once you reach the Paris hub, as you're instantly bombarded by the game's insane lack of polish and rubbish mechanics like Lara moving objects granting her body upgrades.
I feel stronger now.
It's difficult to believe that Angel of Darkness is even a core game. The language of Tomb Raider I showed you before is gone. With no grid-based system, the platforming has no consistency at all, and it feels like a betrayal of Tomb Raider's gameplay. The fact that this was Core's last official work on Tomb Raider is upsetting and unfair. To the surprise of no one, the Angel of Darkness bombed. It barely sold better than Tomb Raider Chronicles, and the game was so obviously unfinished that Sony wouldn't allow the US version of the game to release in the UK market. This caused the game to miss Eidos' window for the financial quarter by 4 days, costing them millions of pounds. Angel of Darkness was even blamed for the failure of the second Tomb Raider film, with Paramount releasing a preposterous statement saying that the game killed people's interest in seeing Lara Croft in any capacity. A post-mortem for Angel of Darkness was held at Eidos to determine who was responsible for the game's state, and Jeremy Heath-Smith took full responsibility. Eidos saw Core as too independent, and Jeremy's management of it not tight enough to prevent a game like Angel of Darkness. Jeremy Heath-Smith resigned from Core on July 15th, 2003, just 3 weeks after the release of Angel of Darkness. He was shortly followed by Adrian Smith. Finally, on July 30th, Eidos announced that they were transferring the development of the next Tomb Raider title from Core to Crystal Dynamics. It's worth noting that there is evidence that Crystal Dynamics tried to continue, or at the very least resolve the events of Angel of Darkness, but those plans were dropped when someone proposed a different direction for their new game, Tomb Raider Legend. This person was none other than Toby Gard, who upon joining Crystal Dynamics as a consultant for Legend, suggested that they reboot the entire franchise. After losing Tomb Raider, Core appointed Gavin Rummery as studio manager, and they began developing titles for the PlayStation Portable, including a failed attempt to remake the first Tomb Raider. Core was eventually sold to Rebellion, and renamed Rebellion Derby. After 2 very bad releases, Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails and the infamous Rogue Warrior, Rebellion Derby was closed in 2010. All great things come to an end. But what really killed Core? Many would point to Eidos and the pressure they put on the company to release Tomb Raider games every year, but Core employees and their other games tell a different story. Core's workplace culture, hiring practices, and development schedules were rooted in standards from the 80s. Game development shifted radically in the next decade, but Core's management of their titles didn't. Simon Phipps left Core in 1994 and described it as one of the best days of his life. This is because he crunched so hard for so long that he just couldn't take it anymore.
Greg Holmes, Kevin Norban were the 2 other founders of the company, directors. They'd left, and the mood changed at Core. The amount of time I was spending at work was just horrendous. I was there 7 days a week. The stress was piling on, but it was getting so bad, and there was a point where I can remember driving down the back road thinking, if I drove off the road now, it would all end. It was getting that bad, and Jane and I were going through an awful lot of just pressure, because I'm turning up at 12 o'clock at midnight, still buzzing from work, going to bed, and then waking up to get into the work in the following morning at 8 o'clock, and then hearing, yeah, well, you went home a bit earlier last night, didn't you? And it was just really just burning me to the ground.
Toby Gard echoed similar sentiments about crunch, saying that, if you want a girlfriend, avoid working in computer games like the plague. If you work 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, for almost 2 years, with barely enough time for a pint, you have no time whatsoever for relationships. The cause of all the crunch at Core during the early to mid-90s was the fundamental belief that most games could be made within a year, and that if the team couldn't get a game out in time, they simply weren't working hard enough. Here is Nathan McCree talking about an interaction he had with Jeremy Heath-Smith during the development of Tomb Raider, and how he realized what was really being asked of him as an employee.
I was gobsmacked, I remember once, in the early part of my career. I was talking to Jeremy. I was moaning because, there wasn't enough time to, get the audio polished properly. And one day he said to me, look, Nathan, for God's sake, nobody gives a shit about audio. We could sell exactly the same number of units if there was no audio in the game than if there was audio in the game. And I said, how can you say that? That's absolute rubbish. How can you say that? He said, well, I'll tell you how I can say that, because we sell the number of units we sell based on whether the magazines give us a good review or not. And when we send our beta version or alpha version to the journalists to review the game, there's no audio on it. We haven't put any audio in the game. They're playing a silent game, and they give us 10 out of 10. And we sell a shitload of copies because of that. Now, he said, we could actually release that game with no audio on it, and the kids would still go and buy it based on the review in the magazines. And my heart sank, because here I was trying to fight this battle, and I was losing straight away because I was fighting somebody who had this very strong mentality about audio in games and was not going to give me any more time or budget or anything. So the only way to improve my situation was to work more hours for no money. And I think this kind of bred the culture in the games industry about the publisher or the developer is not going to pay you overtime. They're not going to give you any more time in the schedule to really do the job that you care about, that you think is going to make a quality game. Then no one's going to give you any more money or budget for that. So your only option is to work more hours in the same time. So you end up working nights, early mornings, weekends. Many people abandon their wives and girlfriends and have all sorts of, personal problems because they believe so much and have so much passion in what they're doing. They're willing or forced to sacrifice everything else in order to achieve what they want to achieve. That's a mentality which I think has to change.
Of course, even Heath-Smith eventually understood that games were growing too big to be made within this time span, and while the average developer count on their games grew, the studio was still stretched too thin between multiple projects. Core was not the Tomb Raider studio. Between 1996 and 2003, other teams at Core put out 8 different games. In retrospective interviews, both Adrian Smith and Jeremy Heath-Smith agree that they should have just had everyone working on multiple Tomb Raider games instead of projects that amounted to nothing. Most notably, Core's Hurdy-Gurdy, released in 2002, was in development for 7 years and bombed on release regardless. All things considered, Eidos' insane demands definitely didn't help the company. Their greed and reckless projections for later Tomb Raider games put Core in a position where they had to adapt and expand too quickly and unnaturally. This led Core to making mistakes like putting an inexperienced team on Tomb Raider Next Generation, while the people who probably could have pulled that off were slaving away on Chronicles, a game that would fail anyways. Like most game development stories, there is no one entity you can place all the blame on. Not Eidos, and certainly not the hard-working people that put these games together. Lara Croft may have outlived Core, but she'll carry the ideas, sacrifices, and bonds of her creators forever.